It's the week ending Saturday the 30th of September, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the government giving the go-ahead to the development of Robank, Britain's largest untapped oil field, a New York judge ruling Donald Trump had fraudulently inflated his wealth by up to $3.6 billion, and the Writers Guild of America ending their 5-month strike after agreeing a deal with Hollywood studios. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in the Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team is Harriet Marsden and Rebekah Evans. And we welcome back the books review editor for the International Affairs Journal, Mariana Vieira. And you're up first, Mariana. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
What's next for Russia? A Nobel Peace Prize?
So nothing has changed in the past year. If anything, things have only gotten worse. In no way could Russia ever, in the current circumstances, be said to be meeting the standards that are required of Human Rights Council members.
Rachel Denber, Deputy Director for Europe at Human Rights Watch, speaking to BBC News on Tuesday. She didn't sound very happy, Mariana. Why?
So Russia is seeking to rejoin the United Nations Human Rights Council, according to a position paper that it has been circulating to UN members asking for their support.
So they've embraced human rights, have they now, the Russians?
It sounds more like after Russia was expelled in April last year, since its forces invaded Ukraine, Russia is now running on an anti-West platform. So they promised to find, quote, adequate solutions for human rights issues, and they seek to stop the council from becoming an instrument which serves the political wills of one group of countries.
Okay. I mean, on that point, Harriet, on the issue that the Human Rights Council of the United Nations appears to have an undue skew towards Western countries, regardless of what we might think about whether that's right or not in terms of attitudes to human rights. Do they have a point? Should they be on it?
I think the notion of an unfair skew is a difficult one to quantify. There's 193 members in the General Assembly, that then within that there's 47 members of the Human Rights Council. So the notion of a Western skew, it's difficult to say whether there would be a skew either way. But in terms of what Mariana was saying about them running on an anti-Western platform, I think that's very significant. So out of the nearly 200 General Assembly members, only 93 countries voted to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council. So that means that most of them didn't, despite all the evidence that works against it. And the countries that abstained are countries like India and South Africa, Mexico and Brazil. And then the countries that voted against suspending them would be countries like China, North Korea, but also in South America as well, Nicaragua and Venezuela. So this idea of a Western skew overall, it's difficult to stand it up.
And it's good to hear that your parrot is as excited about this as you are, Harriet. But then in a way, Rebekah, the fact that China have a vote at all on whether or not Russia should have been suspended from the Human Rights Council, it's a sort of farcical situation. If China and Uzbekistan and countries like that are in the Human Rights Council, you can see why Russia is angry at having been excluded.
No, exactly. I think there is a level of hypocrisy here. Not every other nation on this Human Rights Council has a spotless record. I mean, you look at countries like El Salvador and Nicaragua, as Harriet mentioned, and Venezuela, where observers have warned of a kind of authoritarian turn in recent years. And then, as you mentioned, Olly, China, where there's been allegations of the country ignoring serious human rights issues, such as violations against the Uyghur population. I think a lot of these countries who are members still have a very dubious record with human rights. Some of them still have the death penalty. Some of them arguably subjugate women. So many of these members aren't blameless, and excluding Russia seems to be hypocritical.
Okay, let's just go down to brass tacks for a minute, Mariana. What does being part of the United Nations Human Rights Council mean? What do they actually do?
So the United Nations Human Rights Council was established in 2006, So each member comes on for a 3-year cycle or term. And the council has primarily 3 mandates. One, to promote universal respect for the protection of all human rights. The second one is to address situations of violations of human rights. And the third one is that they undertake this universal periodic review, which is based or meant to be based on objective and reliable information. And they look at how each state is fulfilling their human rights obligations.
So that they look at it, but they don't have the power to do anything about it.
Yes, in a way. So what they do is that they combine this idea of soft and tougher approaches. So they mostly focus on state capacity building through technical assistance, but they also provide a platform that you don't really have in many other places where you can criticize other states on the international stage. So as we were talking about China earlier, the council has never actually, so they work mostly through resolutions, which are based on agenda items that they prioritize and when it comes to human rights. And they've never had one issued to do with China before. And so I was also going to add that the human rights record of a country is not disqualifying. All it takes is the vote of the majority to become part of it.
Should it be?
I think it has to do with the criteria. So I definitely think it should count, and in a way, it does count towards whether a country can be part of the council. So every year or every time there's elections, the council puts together a full report on how suited the candidates are, and they divide them between candidates that are unqualified, questionable, or qualified. So they give like a very thorough report to sort of like help other countries be informed when they're voting on who should take up the new positions. So I think it does matter in a way. Maybe it should matter more, but then again, it's hard to say who would decide what would matter or where the information would come from.
It's not that complicated, though, is it, Harriet? I mean, if you're volunteering to be part of the organisation that monitors human rights, it seems reasonable that the entry requirement should be changed to be you abide by the minimum standards of human rights.
Yeah, it's very difficult to talk about entry criteria, as Mariana and Rebekah have both said, because no country has a spotless record, and you would have to, how far back would you go? Although it is worth noting that in the case of China, when Rebekah mentioned the Uyghur genocide, which was certified by the US State Department in 2021, that was after China joined the Human Rights Council. So the timing is relevant there. But yeah, you're right. It's very difficult to find a country with a spotless human rights record, whether now or in history. But
Putin is currently wanted by the International Criminal Court.
This is the absolute crux of the matter. Putin is wanted by the International Criminal Court, the ICC, for only the second time in its history. In March this year, they issued a public arrest warrant to a sitting head of state. The only time they'd done that previously was against the then leader of Sudan, which was al-Bashir in 2009. This situation, Russia's legal standing and Putin's standing internationally, is not comparable to the other countries that we've been discussing. And this is where it got into trouble earlier this year with the BRICS summit in South Africa, when Putin had to skip the summit, basically, because he couldn't come to South Africa, who are signatories of the ICC, because he's wanted for war crimes and they would have had to arrest him.
Rebekah.
Yeah, I think the BRICS summit that Harriet's mentioning is super interesting, because I think it was allowing Putin to kind of test the waters on international diplomacy. You've got Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa all gathering in one place. And as we've talked about earlier, these are countries that have abstained in the vote on the Human Rights Council. So I think he's kind of flirting with potentially what could be said at that summit to perhaps swing the vote his way. And I mean, more countries are joining BRICS in the future. We've got the UAE, Egypt, Iran, and Saudi Arabia to consider also. So I don't think Russia might be as much of a pariah as it has been in the past, although it will be interesting to see how Putin navigates all of those international events logistically.
But BRICS is a kind of major trading bloc, isn't it, Mariana? Whereas in this case, the Human Rights Commission, what's the advantage for Russia to be part of this? It's probably not influence. So is it just credibility? And if it is credibility, that's quite good for the United Nations, isn't it? That at least Putin still recognises that it's worthwhile being a member of this sort of thing.
I think, yes, this brings together so many different points. And also to what Rebekah was saying about the BRICS, it's not just in there where Russia is actively also worried about its international standing. This is one of the main reasons as to why it wants to join the United Nations Human Rights Council. But also just earlier this month at the G20 summit, there was evidence to suggest that there might be a change in tone / the mood among the other countries that Harriet was talking about that either abstained or voted against actually ejecting Russia from the council. So in their statement, in the New Delhi statement, they appeared to offer support for Kiev. They acknowledged the human suffering caused by the war. They condemned the actions that have been taken throughout the Russia-Ukraine war, but they don't name any aggressors. So there is no reference to Russia, and this is in sharp contrast with the communique that they had in 2020 in the last G20 summit. Ukraine's president Volodymyr Zelensky has also he was invited to address the delegates in Bali via video last year. He was not extended an invitation this year to do the same, and so it sort of shows a little bit. Going also back to the point about Western skew versus bias, it shows a little bit of how the overall shift in power towards the global south and how these other organizations and economic blocs are becoming more important, where most governments and societies in the West have come out strongly to support Kiev. The rest of the world has taken a more cautious approach, and this is becoming a bit more intensified.
Yeah, but to return to my question then, if it's so unimportant and ineffectual, why does he want to be part of it?
It's not like it has changed its efficiency from before or after Putin has joined. It remains the same format, the same forum, and I think it has more to do with the fact that it was expelled before, and this is only the second time it has happened in the council. The other time before being Libya in 2011. So I think that's quite a spot on its record for Russia, and I think that's more something that they're trying to ratify. And whether it gets whether they vote to have Russia in or not is probably not as significant as the fact that it's trying to have this thermometer check of how many countries would actually support its ambition at the moment.
Okay, final point, Harriet.
I think the question is not whether the Human Rights Council matters, but whether it would cease to matter at all if Russia were allowed to rejoin. I think that's the really crucial point. If Russia is allowed to join the UN Human Rights Council, while the UN itself is saying that there's this deteriorating human rights situation in Ukraine, while there's mounting evidence of massively widespread war crimes like torture, like rape, like the abduction of children, if Russia, with all of that very, very, very made public and by the UN itself, is allowed to join the Human Rights Council, then isn't that the thing that would make it not matter at all? Because if diplomats are saying that Russia is campaigning, offering countries grain and arms to get them on side. So if you've got, to my mind, if the question of whether it matters, if you allow Russia to join on this basis, and like Rebekah was saying, logistically, how would it even work? Would they not have summits in countries where he would be subject to an arrest warrant? Like, how would it actually work? So, I mean, it's almost farcical.
Okay, we'll have a touch of class from Rebekah after this. Okay, Rebekah, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is this the week we all become working class?
Equal rights, equal responsibilities. My friends, the class war is over, but the struggle for true equality has only just begun.
Tony Blair speaking at the Labour Party conference back when he was leader in 1999. Rebekah, the class war was over 20 years ago. What's the story?
Well, this week, the British Social Attitudes Study has shown that more Britons are identifying as working class when compared with 40 years ago. So that's 46%, up from 32% in 1983. And the vast majority of those respondents also said that class significantly impacts their opportunities in life. Now, as we've just heard in the clip, Tony Blair said that the class war was over in 1999, But I think potentially this research shows that his dreams are officially dead.
But is it class war to define yourself as working class? Isn't it just that the definitions have shifted?
Oh no, absolutely. I think it's really important that we all realise that everyone will have their own definition of class, especially as it relates to their individual circumstances. But I think class boundaries are far more fluid now than they used to be. There are a lot of traditional working class professions, such as, those who were working in the mines, for instance. A lot of them would have considered themselves to be working class, and obviously that section of society doesn't exist anymore. But when it comes to this social attitude survey, most of the respondents associated class with education, occupation, income, and other cultural factors like where you were born. So these are still things that resonate with people today.
Yeah. I mean, what's your feeling on it, Harriet? Do you think it is possible to be, I don't know, something that would have previously been seen very much as a middle-class profession, a teacher, a doctor, a journalist even, and be working class?
I think it's a really interesting question, and I do think that this is a fascinating story. If your markers of how you identify class or how you identify yourself and what class barriers that you're in are based on education, occupation, and income, and your job remains static, but your costs skyrocket while your income stays the same, then your financial position has shifted. So you can objectively feel poorer despite being middle class. And I think that's where the cost of living crisis, but it goes back a bit beyond that. Yes, the cost of living crisis has played a huge part in this, but this we're going back the last 20 years we're talking about that these changes have occurred. And if you look at how costs have changed in that time, various middle class markers like going to university have become much more widespread, while others, like owning a home, have become pretty much impossible. So everything has shifted economically underneath that underpins this. And childcare is costing so much in some places now, women are having to stop work at all. Like you mentioned a journalist. I couldn't be more of an example of middle class. I'm from a middle class background. I had middle class parents working in middle class professions. I have 2 degrees and do a very nice job. And I still, at the moment, feel poor. Like I'm still struggling to buy a damn cucumber in the supermarket. So if I'm saying that, the question is not whether we're all working class, but whether it's even possible for most people to be what we thought of as middle class now.
But also, the flip side of that, Rebekah, is clearly it's possible that people who feel working class might be earning 60, 80 grand, might own their own businesses, but they feel working class because they're from up north and their parents worked in domestic jobs, or they feel they've had to scrap to get everything they've got, or they didn't go to university. And so they answer the question, I'm working class, but are they really?
Well, no, exactly. There's 1 in 3 of the richest in the country, which is surprising to me, considered to be those earning more than £40,000, consider themselves as working class. And that's something that the head of lifestyle economics at the Institute for Economic Affairs described as inverted snobbery. I really like that phrase, inverted snobbery. It really stood out to me. But I think there are so many different contemporary considerations at play. I mean, when you look at someone who has perhaps had a kind of pull up your bootstraps life, where they've come from being working class and perhaps are a millionaire or billionaire status, for example, perhaps they don't want to entirely remove themselves from their working class roots, and that might be the reason why they identify as working class.
Which strikes me as a fascinatingly British thing, Mariana. I mean, what Rebekah's just described there is social mobility, upward mobility, right? The kind of thing that it seems to me in other countries of Europe, people are proud about. I come from a poor background, but look what I've achieved. Look at the job I have. I own my own house, or whatever the marker is. In this country, there's still this preoccupation to define yourself, nonetheless, as working class, despite those achievements.
I find it fascinating. The more I was reading about how the class system has always been a significant part of British culture, but in the way that it becomes this hierarchical structure, which sort of divides the nation a little bit. So even when it's not about economics, then it becomes something about like a cultural signifier. And I just got into like a rabbit hole reading about cultural capital and how it can be about the things that you acquire, being a member of a particular social class, like behaviors and tastes or skills or material belongings. They are so much more nuanced. I was also really fascinated by the numbers on the study when they were talking about. I was just trying to think who it matters, which class people belong to, especially, and because the idea of working class, and again, like you were saying, Ollie, like the idea of social mobility is so important. But at the same time, it was, I think, 48% of those from the poorest households who said they felt middle class or had no class identity at all, and I found this fascinating. And at the same time, the same study showed there was a growing alignment with class since it was first carried out in the 1980s. So at the time, 43% of the respondents had no class identification, but now it's only 22% who don't have that sort of identification. So if it's identification is going up, but if the barriers are becoming more fluid in terms of economics or social mobility, then it becomes again the cultural thing, which is even harder and fuzzier to define.
Or maybe it's just that we're in a more polarized, divisive time, Harriet. Everyone's defining themselves in all sorts of ways. And, being very clear on what your class is might be just one of the reactions to having a government clearly with a ruling class component as part of it.
I think that you mentioned the government, and I think that's a really key part of it. The government, the political narrative is constantly beats the drum about class. Like we've just seen with John Prescott, with Tony Blair, it's this constant beating the drum of working class to middle class, working class to middle class. There's the divide, there's the journey, there's your estimate, there's your motivation. So when you've got the political, what are effectively the ruling classes, banging on about the working classes, and you've got novels and TV programs kind of portraying the working class experience, but without actually involving any working class people. Why shouldn't people feel like they can claim this identity when other people are profiting from it, whether that's financially or whether that's politically? But also, in terms of what you said about the divisive, how divided we are, it's worth noting that the things that used to unite us, like workplaces or unions, trade unions or communities, churches, that kind of thing, those structures have largely disappeared. So now class is perceived less like as a cultural identity and more as a personal a choice. And I do think that that's reflective of how our society has become much more inward focused and individualistic. And I think that that is a symptom of a wider malaise that isn't necessarily all economic.
I suppose there's another intersection, isn't there, Rebekah, with what is called woke culture? I mean, that's, so thinly spread now as a term. It can mean almost anything. But the point is people being aware of their privilege. If you're aware of your privilege, then perhaps you're more likely to say what class you are, whereas before you wouldn't have had an answer to that question.
Arguably yes, but arguably no. I think this is why class, I think, is so fascinating within this country, because a lot of quote unquote upper class people would probably balk at the idea of being called upper class, and therefore I think this is where class boundaries become a bit more fluid, and class almost becomes like a costume in a sense, where
well, because then you do come up against income again, don't you? They might balk at it because they'd say, well, yes, I live in Kensington and Chelsea, but I don't have any money.
Yeah, exactly. I think, your background, you can't help your background, and perhaps you might, if you're forging out by yourself, you might be slightly different to your parents if they're not giving you handouts or a place to live. But yeah, it's just, I've come across people who do not like being called upper middle class, despite going to private school, going out on multiple foreign holidays a year, going to, dine in some of the top Michelin star restaurants, for example. And I think class becomes almost a stigma on both ends of the spectrum within this country. So that's where it becomes fascinating to see how, as Harriet says, each individual is navigating this class system that's been so deeply entrenched within British society for centuries.
Harriet.
I think Rebekah's absolutely right that it's become a stigma in all sorts of ways, both the labels of upper middle or middle class and working class, but also both to a certain extent a badge of honor. So that's where it gets really difficult when these labels and these identities become both stigmatized and something to aspire to. Then you have this increased sense of who am I and where do I fit into this structure? But when you say that you think that class consciousness has intense, like Marx actually predicted that that's what would happen, that class consciousness would intensify among the workers. But James Bloodworth, who wrote Hired, has written a very good piece about all of this in Unheard, has pointed out that actually isn't borne out by the data at all. That's been completely turned on its head. Class consciousness hasn't actually increased at all. If anything, it's not class consciousness so much as a personal label that has increased. But I think it's worth noting as well that there has been a change in the method of this survey. Like, I think we just need to think about the methodology a bit, because it went from face-to-face to online in 2020, and I do think that that's always going to skew results in a slightly different way.
Yeah, and social attitude surveys, Mariana, are interesting because it shows what people think, but I suppose it is about what they think rather than perhaps a more objective fact. They think there's less social mobility than there used to be. That might be true, but it might not be true in all cases. It's about how they feel.
Yeah, and this is super interesting also because as Harriet brought up Karl Marx, it's in Capital, and if you study Marxism, which I did for my undergraduate, making me rather privileged given the universities I've been to, but I think it's such a clear definition in terms of your relation to the means of production. It's not something you can think or feel. It's just where you stand in whether you're selling your labor power or whether you're part of the group that's managing it, so the bourgeoisie. So it's so different from the sort of surveys that are going on. And also, one thing to mention is that people don't just feel a certain way about class when it comes to their identity. Identities are intersectional, so they don't just feel more or less poor, more or less able to move up in the rungs, depending on whether their parents are also a working class background. There's other things such as gender, race, and also where the university access that comes in as well. So I think it gets missed out a little bit when the surveys are focused on just one specific aspect of an identity and don't really consider all the other ways in which it intersects. So I've been to 3 Russell Group universities, but then I'm also an immigrant, and then it just gets confusing as to where you're sort of meant to fit in a very neat box. And I don't think humans necessarily do that, although the politicians really try to make it seem that way.
Okay, flat caps off. More from Harriet after this. Okay, Harriet, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is the dream over for Japan's World Expo?
Diamonds by Japanese boy band Generations there, in a video posted to X where 2 of the members of the band appear to be dancing with a giant jellyfish. Harriet, what's going on?
That's the mascot for the Osaka 2025 World Expo. So what's happening this week is that news has come out to suggest that this World Expo that was due to be held in Osaka in Japan in 2025 it could be under threat thanks to spiraling costs. So this World Expo, this happens every 5 years, and it's a big 6-month showcase of technological and cultural exhibitions by 150 countries and regions. But on Monday, organizers said that the estimated cost of constructing the venue on this man-made island in Osaka Bay called Yumeshima, which means Dream Island, has risen to 230 billion yen, which is about $1.5 billion. Now, that's the second time they've raised that estimate, and it's almost double the initial estimate.
Okay. That's not a surprise, though, is it, really? I mean, if you bid for one of these big world events, you know you're going to spend double what you estimate initially, really. How under threat do you think this event really is? They're not going to pull it, are they?
That's a really good question, and that's a question I think there's been some back and forth on either side. I think it's unlikely that it won't go ahead in some format, but because it was due to attract 28 million visitors and billions of dollars in investment, but it is a surprise. Japan is suffering from really high inflation, which obviously means the cost of any long-term infrastructure project is going to be constantly reevaluated. And that means material costs and labor costs go up. But Japan is also suffering from a chronic labor shortage, and they're introducing new restrictions on construction overtime next year, which, although organizers had asked for exemptions from expo workers, the unions of the lawyers went ballistic about that and decided not to be okay with. And because it's an offshore location, it's a man-made island, so you need an undersea road, and all the other participating countries are suffering from high inflation and labor chronic shortages as well. So there's been a general lack of enthusiasm, and there's been delays for everyone else constructing their pavilions too.
But I mean, if the purpose of bidding in the first place, because you volunteer to do this, don't you, Rebekah? It's not something that's thrust upon you. If the purpose of volunteering to host the expo in the first place is reputational, it's not worth the embarrassment of not then holding it, surely. That's worse for your reputation than just doing the cut price version.
Well, yeah, I think, you know what, them backing out at this stage would probably be a mistake, but at the same time, it's about what costs they're willing to pay when it comes to this expo event. And I don't think that's just from an economic standpoint. I mean, obviously, Harriet's just talked about the chronic labour shortage and the fact that organisers have asked for these expo workers to be exempt. But we've all seen the kind of debacle and tragedy that lax rules in that regard can cause in the construction of these big stadiums. I mean, we only have to look at the Men's World Cup in Qatar to see the kind of the atrocities really that have occurred as a result of making people work for obscenely long hours and under really not that great conditions. Not saying that that's necessarily what's happening here, of course, but surely there needs to come a point where they realise that this is perhaps too high of a price to pay, even when you take out the mounting costs that this kind of event is incurring.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Qatar because, Mariana, the top two contenders for the next World Expo are Rome and Riyadh. You sort of think, have we learned nothing? Like, you know, if Saudi Arabia get the expo, which seems likely, it's just going to be all the same stories again, isn't it? What's the point of bidding for these World Expos? They obviously do make a difference to these countries that want them.
So I saw at least 3 examples of really positive expos in the past. So the Expo 1970 in Osaka is credited with growing Japan's economy, Japan's gross domestic product by 2.1%. The Expo in 2000 in Hanover reportedly generated $13 billion in economic benefits for Germany. And more recently, the Expo 2010 in Shanghai holds the record for the largest number of attendees. And it generated $12 billion just from direct revenues alone, and a total of $218 billion in revenue, in tourist revenues. So there's definitely an economic incentive. I'm not entirely sure that Saudi Arabia's public is convinced, because I was looking at this piece in the Arab Times talking about all the benefits of potentially hosting the Expo 2030. And it's very much about creating jobs, the long-term use of the infrastructure. They also have this thing about being the first expo that's going to have zero carbon emissions. So it's also like a way of publicizing their, not just their industry, but their accomplishments, which talks a little bit to this cultural diplomacy / soft power significance, which is incredibly hard to quantify.
Yeah, well, I mean, but someone's quantifying it, aren't they, Harriet? They're making an equation. They're saying, oh, well, this means news organizations talking about us without beheading being in the sentence. They're talking about us for another reason.
Right. No, exactly. If you look at it as just a purely, just looking at it as a purely mathematical equation, to Rebekah's point that it wouldn't seem financially worth it. If this new estimate is correct, that it's 230 billion yen, and presumably that may be revised again at a later stage. So let's call it 300 billion yen. Let's just say the estimate, between friends, the estimate of what it could generate for the economy is about 2 trillion yen. So if you're just looking at on that basis, on a cost basis, it would seem worth it. And, you know, the increased costs, if they're shared between central government, local government, and private companies, then it could be a shared burden. And to Mariana's point that the last one in Japan, not only was it a huge economic boost, but it also transformed this defeated empire into an economic powerhouse. It's about your reputation as well. It's an opportunity to show your history, your culture, how you use like science, how you use social developments. And Osaka is a really amazing example, or has many amazing examples of, you know, sustainable development. So it's a lot more than just money at stake here. So yes, it would be really, really, really bad to cancel. But obviously a flop would be incredibly embarrassing. But it wouldn't, if you even manage to pull off half decent World Expo, it's still overall of net benefit to my mind.
What is the relevance, though, of an expo in terms of what's actually there, Rebekah, these days? Because, you know, on my history show, Today in History with the Retrospectives, we go back often through, you know, World's Fairs, the Great Exhibition of 1851. These were genuinely, groundbreakingly significant events. People unveiled incredible technology people had never seen before, you know, steam power, film, the Eiffel Tower. What's come out of World Expos in the last 30 years that's changed our lives?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, the history of World Expos is pretty astonishing. I mean, the UK did it first, as you say, in Crystal Palace, Hyde Park in 1851. And there's obviously been so many advancements since then. But this question kind of makes me think about the last expo that was held, which was in Dubai. And I was recently in Dubai this year, and I visited the Dubai Frame. They talked a lot about the expo and kind of the goals that they had set there for a mobile, sustainable world with opportunities for everyone. And
tick, achieved.
I really liked it. I really did like it. I think, you know what? I thought, this is incredible, but it seemed like a utopia, and it kind of made me question whether any of it is actually achievable, and whether it's all just idealistic. To me, what I got out of that was that, okay, the World Expo has done some great things in the past, but to me now it just feels a bit self-indulgent. I know we've talked about how it offers countries the opportunity to show off their national identity, but at the end of the day, it does boil down to money, and I think this is an awful lot of money to be spending on what is essentially a vanity project.
Well, also, we live in a more international world generally, don't we, Mariana? You know, the internet is an international concern. You can go to any of the world's major cities and taste food from the others. Some of that contact that used to happen at these sort of events just doesn't feel as necessary.
No, I absolutely agree. There's this book from last year called The Kingdom of Characters, which actually talks about how important these conferences and knowledge exchange was when China was trying to modernize its script and the sort of like inventions that it had to get from, especially in the US. And the language wouldn't have been able to modernize as easily as it did without these sorts of fairs taking place. Whereas nowadays, I think I agree with Rebekah. I felt very skeptical that the theme for the Osaka Expo for 2025 is the quest for sustainable development. And I just can't imagine the carbon footprint of 28 million people flying, even if all the materials that make up all these type A special pavilions that are commissioned to the different countries, which still cost millions of pounds. The cost and the benefits are so much economic that for something that's looking at sustainability, I'm not sure why the environment is not being talked about more.
I think that is absolutely fair. I think that the focus on a sustainable future would at the moment seem maybe not quite as urgent as we need it to be. But I don't agree that these types of these bilateral relationship building projects and these massive showcases are unnecessary. If anything, you could say that they're more necessary than ever. I mean, we're talking about, yes, we have the internet, and yes, we have much more cultural contact between countries, but we're talking about, like, this is a serious relationship building project, and it's nothing to do with war, and it's nothing to do with economics, and it's nothing to, I mean, it's to do, but it's one of the most positive uniting, or supposed to be one of the most positive uniting international endeavors that there is. And I think that in the where we find ourselves now, having to collaborate on things like sustainable development and peacekeeping and other international preoccupations like we were talking about before, I don't know how much of a better way we have than something like this.
And people forget, we did get Blackadder back and forth out of the Millennium Dome money.
And we got the V&A and the Natural History Museum out of the profits generated from the first World Expo in London. So it's not just about now, it's about the future as well.
Well, on that optimistic note, my thanks to Harriet and Mariana and Rebekah. You can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tap follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription if you go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye.